When looking for the king of podcasts, you're at the wrong channel.
Well, excuse me!
Looking for good ideas for life? You're far from good hands.
Hey, bud, what's your problem?
If you think the listener is always right, you're far from the right place.
Out of order! Even in the future, nothing works!
Hosted by a Northeasterner by birth, but a rebel by choice.
Are you threatening me?
If you want a host that floats between love and madness,
and we know the night is always gonna be here anyway. Thinking of you's working up my appetite. Looking forward to a little afternoon delight.
then play on and listen to Crazy Train Radio.
All right, guys, listen to this blues riff and B. Watch me for the changes and try and keep up, okay?
Within the gaming world, there are your general gamers, but then there are those that enjoy the dark underbelly of gaming. If you're one of those that enjoy the dark underbelly of gaming, we certainly got the place to send you. Scorpion Lair Games. That's right, Scorpion Lair Games is the creators of the true crime hit Killers, the card game. Let's not forget they also have Killers Clothing Company, the profiler game, and things like the 5-Minute Murder channel on YouTube. And we certainly can't forget the new book that is certainly a hit, Beyond the Headliners, True Crimes, Myths, and Legends. Make sure you visit Jeff and the Scorpion Lair Games on Facebook and everywhere today.
Hi, I'm Bill Ripkin, and you're listening to Crazy Train Radio.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages. I'll start off by saying there are deep dives that we like to do, then there are deep dives. So this next guest has been around the game of baseball for many years and has been publishing his unique brand of statistical information under the Shandler Enterprises, named in 1986. He has also been a fantasy leaguer since 1984. If I remember correct, the Detroit Tigers may have won the World Series that year. And he's been a simulator gamer since 1971. He has a book called Fantasy Espert. So let's go ahead and welcome Mr. Ron Shandler. Ron, how are you doing, sir?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Of course. So I'll ask this first and foremost. How's the response for the book been since it's come out?
It's been pretty good. I have a built-in following from all the many years of writing and publishing the Baseball Forecaster. So there are a lot of folks who have been following my story now for close to 40 years. So they're interested in the backstory and the history, and then Fantasy Expert pretty much encapsulates all that. So yeah, so far it's been very good.
Well, I'll start out with this too when it comes to the book. And there's a little rumor on the internet, and we know everything's true on this World Wide Web. But apparently there was stories and images that were cut out. But the good news is that if they go to your website and the URL, they can find the full content for Fantasy Expert, correct?
That is correct. Yeah. I guess a little bit of the backstory helps on this. I had been collecting all these artifacts for many, many years. And so when I decided to write this book, which became my pandemic project, I had all these clippings and images and logos and whatnot that I wanted to include in it. But when Triumph Books decided to publish it, they said, we're going to need permissions for all this stuff. And that would mean going back and finding companies that have gone out of business, history that people wouldn't remember anymore to verify the authenticity of some of these things. So a lot of the photos and images that I had wanted to include in the book had to be cut and put into an outtakes file in order to have Triumph publish the book. But we have the PDF with the outtakes that folks are able to take a look at. So it all is not lost. But yeah, some of those items could not actually get into the book itself.
And, obviously we'll be sending people to the website and all that as we go along. And the link will be on all versions of this. But you mentioned this was a pandemic project. So you started this during COVID. Why was that the right time? Was it because of maybe 4 months of no baseball for you in particular? Or?
Yeah, that's exactly it. When baseball stopped and there was basically nothing to do, as a side thing, I was actually running these retro mock drafts with some of the experts in the industry just to keep busy doing some type of drafting activity to keep our hand in the game. But from a writing perspective, there was nothing to write about other than the business aspect of what was going on. And I didn't want to get into those weeds. So I knew that I was probably going to write a book of this type at some point. And it seemed with X number of months ahead of me with no baseball, it seemed like a good opportunity to start it at that point. And it was a good enough block of time for me to get deep enough into it that I got the momentum to keep it going. And it probably took a good 3 years to get the first draft done. That was presentable. But yeah, it all started when baseball stopped.
And, for me, and I'm going to be 40 in about a week, when I think about the game of baseball, there's certain, I guess, milestone periods of the game and changes of the game, I guess you would say. Because I'm a Hall of Fame member, as I appreciate the history of the game. But at least within my lifetime, you have the strike of 94, you have the period coming out of the strike that some would say is the drug or PED era of the game, your Sosas, your Maguires, the home run chases, all that fun stuff, Bonds. And then the other period that I would mention as well is post-COVID. And you just mentioned it. So how do you think the game was done coming out of the pandemic these past couple of years?
Coming out of the pandemic, I think the game has struggled a little bit to find its footing. But I think in many ways we may even be stronger now than we were before. I'm kind of progressive when it comes to the game. I am not a traditionalist. I want the best product to put on the field, and so all these rule changes that have been enacted in the last couple of years, most of them I like. A couple of them I don't, but most of them I like, and I think they are intended to appeal to the way fans watch the game today, the way society processes information today. I mean, there's a reason why football surpassed baseball in popularity 20 years ago. I mean, baseball needed to kind of change, and I think the powers that be have done a good job in moving the game forward. And I hope to see more changes to help fine tune this game and make it more watchable for fans. Because my generation here, we remember what the game was like in the '60s and the '70s, and the game now is so completely different. But we have to acknowledge the fact that society is different now. We didn't have the internet back then. We didn't have information at our fingertips. So what's happened in the last few years since the pandemic, I think, is a positive thing in pushing this game forward.
And with the book, which, like I said, it's Fantasy Espert. You mentioned it's Triumph Books, which I've dealt with Triumph for several years now in the show's history, and it's great folks. They usually have great products, this being one of them. Products, I mean books. But this book would be part memoir, part madcap history. Why would you go with the terminology of memoir with the book?
Well, the book is a history, but it's told from my personal viewpoint. It's told from my experiences, so it's really framed as more of a memoir, because I experienced a lot of the things that went on in the fantasy baseball industry. I was there almost at the beginning. I've been playing fantasy baseball since 1984. The first rotisserie league baseball book came out in 1984, and at that point, the game itself had only been about 4 years old, and the rotisserie league baseball book is what sort of launched the commercial success of fantasy baseball. So I was there at the beginning. I played my first league back then, and I started the Baseball Forecaster 2 years later in '86. So I've kind of seen the industry go through all its cycles. Weathering the strike in '94, being questioned about how do we handle the steroids era, like you mentioned. I mean, from a perspective of somebody who did player projections, the steroid era was a very difficult time for us because we didn't know which players were using them and who wasn't. So I've seen all this stuff. So from that perspective, it made more sense for me to tell my story. This way, it could be a little bit more of a personal perspective on how this industry has grown and evolved over the years, all while telling the actual history itself. So it's kind of a hybrid, I guess you would say.
Well, it's interesting with the growth of not only the game itself, but the fantasy sports, let's just say. And I would say it's grown from, say, a cottage industry to a national obsession. So with that being said, we also got to tinker in a little bit of sports gambling. So how does that, do you think, mesh with the fantasy sports that people do with the leagues and the different things, but also the gambling aspect as well?
Yeah, it's changed how the game's played a little bit. Me personally, I don't have that gambling gene. I've always viewed fantasy sports as an intellectual pursuit. I always wanted to challenge myself to be able to project what players are going to do, to figure out how to assemble the optimal team. I've never played for money of any consequence, really. So for me, the entering the whole gambling aspect of it just really changes the way the game is played a little bit, and not always in the positive ways. So, but I mean, gambling has been around forever, and in the early days of fantasy baseball, we were working very, very hard to avoid being perceived as gambling, because in Major League Baseball had just come through the Pete Rose situation in 1989, so they were trying to avoid anything that even smelled of gambling. And at its core, I mean, to be honest now, at its core, fantasy sports is a form of gambling. You're trying to predict future events with imperfect knowledge, but by the same token, it's no different than playing the stock market, and that's the comparison I always make. If playing the stock market is a legal activity, so should be playing fantasy sports, because we are using information to try to project what's going to happen. We're not just throwing darts at a dartboard and with our eyes closed. So I think the gambling aspect does change the game a little bit, but at its core, it's always been a bit of a gambling game.
And obviously you just mentioned Mr. Rose, and obviously most people know his story. I've done deep dives, not on a personal level of his story, books and documentaries and stuff. And I know there's going to be a documentary coming up. And it's funny you bring that up as far as Pete and whatnot, because there was actually, I guess, about 2 months ago at this point, some guys who got in trouble, both in the minors and the majors, with one being banned for life, the same rule that Pete broke, Rule 21.
Right.
But, you know, I because of the evolution of things, and obviously there are, different gambling affiliates, whether it be Bally's or different casinos and just the different folks advertising with Major League Baseball. So I think that makes things a little murky. But do you think that Pete would ever get into the Hall of Fame, why he's still alive? Because from what I understand, everything I've researched and all, most of his gambling that he was questioned for and then suspended for in '89 was mostly during his managing years. Mm-hmm. So, and who's to say he would have been a Hall of Famer as a manager? We don't know. That's only a small window there. But I'm thinking just of his playing career and the stats, 42-56 and the awards, Rookie of the Year, World Series championships, stuff that was done on the field. Do you think Pete could eventually be inducted into the Hall of Fame just on the statistic side of things?
Well, certainly he merits it. I would hope at some point he is. There's no question that from a purely baseball performance perspective, Pete Rose should be in the Hall of Fame, as should Roger Clemens and Barry Bonds and all those others who have been dinged as, possible steroid users, some proven, some not. I've always been the performance on the field is what counts. And because the Hall of Fame has the character clause, that kind of, your word murky is perfect, because that's really what kind of makes things more of a subjective decision rather than an objective decision. We're watching the game, we see what they're objectively, they are Hall of Famers. They should be in the Hall of Fame. Familiar with it's in the outtakes part of the book. Pete Rose actually was almost reinstated, allegedly, back in, I think 2004. Apparently there was an agreement on the table for him to be reinstated, because at that point he had never admitted it. But apparently when his own book came out with the admit that he had gambled, they pulled the offer off, and he was not reinstated. And this came from Will Carroll, actually, who had reported this through Baseball Prospectus back in the early 2000s. So, I mean, I think the door could be open at some point, and given, like you say, with all the with Major League Baseball getting into bed with these gambling operations now, you would think at some point there would be an opportunity for him at least to get in for his accomplishments as a ball player.
Because, and the reason I asked the question is, not many people think or realize the Major League Baseball does not operate the Hall of Fame, and that rule was put into place in '91, as far as if you were on the ban list from the Major League Baseball for whatever reason, that you wouldn't be eligible for the Hall of Fame, which was the year that he would have been eligible to be voted on for the first time. So, it's two separate entities, but they, all that fun stuff. Yeah. But with the fantasy expert and the games and stuff, how do you think, like you mentioned, that MLB tried to distance itself with the whole Pete scandal and stuff at the time with fantasy sports and fantasy baseball, etc. But how do you think they've done with it? With, obviously it's become a big business, whether it be on a gambling side or just on a fantasy side, with the population of things like the internet and all that stuff over the past couple of decades.
Mm-hmm. Well, they've adopted fantasy baseball because they eventually realized they could make money off of it. I mean, that's really what it came down to. 2006 with the the fantasy sports carve out in the UIGEA law that was passed. It determined that fantasy baseball was a legal activity, and at that point, Major League, actually even before Major League Baseball started running their own games, they figured this was something the fans wanted, and so they adopted it and they started promoting it. Never as much as the NFL, mind you, but they dipped their toes in, and they realized they could make money off of it. Major League Baseball Advanced Media just took it on and started generating a revenue stream. So that's kind of a typical approach. You know, if it's something they can make money off of, they're going to figure out a way to spin it, and I think that's what they've done with gambling as well. So
Obviously, now you went into business for yourself, but eventually ended up selling the business. And I was reading in the book about you having how ironic, a thank you party at a ball game with 25 or so of your employees and all that stuff. So what was that like, dipping your toes and going full tilt into running your own business around the game?
Well, it was always my desire to have my own business, and as I write about early in the book, I was never cut out to be an employee working for someone else. I been fired from more jobs than I can count, and I my own ways of doing things, and I don't buy into office politics, and if I can find a better way to do something, I don't want to have to deal with 7 levels of management to get something done. So so I started this business on a kitchen table back in 1986, and my wife and I just slowly grew the thing over time until the point where actually, this is interesting. In a couple of weeks, this is the 26th, I think it was the first week in August, will be my 30th anniversary of getting fired from my last corporate job. So in 1994, I lost my last corporate job, and so I've been on my own ever since. Basically, the baseball forecaster, baseballhq.com, was able to support my family at that point, and built the business over the next 10, 12 years or so. There's nothing like being your own boss and being able to control and market and run an organization. It's been a great ride.
Now, obviously, there was at least one major influence that I was reading about, and for people who may not be familiar with them, you were a reader of the Bill James baseball abstract, but you discovered it in a local bookstore and then grew your obsession from there. So, and you had a funny story about meeting Mr. James the first time. So how much of an influence was Bill James in what you ended up going on to do?
It was a massive influence. Before I found that book, I was among the millions and millions and millions and millions of baseball fans who watched the game on the television and saw the statistics on the bottom of the screen: home runs, RBIs, batting average, wins, losses, ERA. And those were the only stats that mattered. Those were the be-all and end-all that described baseball performance. You don't need anything else. If a guy hit 300 and drove in 100 runs, he was a 300 hitter, and you can expect 100 RBIs each year. There was nothing about skills metrics. There was nothing about looking at the game a different way. And Bill James just looked at the game in a completely different way. And just reading that first abstract of his, the 1984 edition was the first one I read, and just seeing that, oh my gosh, catchers have an effect on pitchers' ERA. Oh my God, the umpires have an effect on the game. It's the things that are common knowledge that they tell us on the broadcasts might not be true. Really, the attendance at California Angels games really didn't go up when Nolan Ryan was pitching, but they said every time Nolan Ryan pitched, attendance went up. And Bill James wrote, no, look, here are the numbers, here are the figures. Had no effect in attendance whatsoever. And it just kind of opened my eyes to what was out there. And having, I have an MBA in statistics and looking at the new types of gauges he was using, these new metrics to try to measure performance and break things down. It just really opened my eyes to what was possible. So I started reading everything in that genre, from Bill James to Pete Palmer to Craig Wright, all these books that were coming out in the late 80s and early 90s that took the mantle from Bill James and started showing different ways we can evaluate players and look at performance. And then I started developing some of the metrics of my own, and that was kind of the springboard. So but Bill James was a huge influence on just my interest in getting into this whole aspect of baseball.
Do you mind telling that story, that first time actually meeting him, where he was looking through your stuff at a convention?
Sure, it's a classic story. It is actually the only time I've met Bill James, and it was I think it was 1990, 91. I was at a Sabre conference in New York, and it was at a time when I was still trying to build my business. I had only been doing this part-time for 4 or 5 years. And Bill had his abstract, his last abstract was in 1988. And in that last abstract, he essentially released all his formulas to the public domain. He said, hey, do what you want with them. I'm done writing about it. So I was using a lot of his metrics in my work and doing some modifications, adding a few of my own, but basically using his work as a springboard for mine and publishing a book, The Baseball Forecaster, that I was trying to sell at this conference. So they had a whole exhibition hall there. I was at a table and set up all my books. On this table, I had my Baseball Forecaster. I also had this smaller book called Prospect Projections, which took his formula for major league equivalencies. And it was just basically a listing of every AA and AAA player and what their MLEs were. It was a very thin book. There was really not much to it. But Bill was at this conference, and he walks into the exhibition hall, and he comes up to my table. And honestly, I was in my mid-20s at that point. I was still in fanboy awe of Bill James, and Bill's a big guy too. He's a big guy. So he comes up to my table, and I can't even get any words out. He introduces himself. He says hi. I say hi, and he picks up the thin Prospect Projections book and starts thumbing through it. And I'm thinking to myself, man, I wish he had picked up the Baseball Forecaster. That's more of a hefty book, a lot more stuff in there. So he's standing there, which probably for about a minute or two, it felt like 6 hours. And he opens the book in front of me, and he puts his finger down on one number in this massive sea of data. And he puts his finger down on it, and he says, "This is wrong." And then he just closes the book, puts it back in the stack, and walks on to the next table. So I was kind of taken aback at that point. I was, a little bit angry, upset, what have you. I reopened the book to the page he was looking at and took a look at this one number in this massive sea of data on the page. And it was the batting average of Atlanta Braves prospect Andy Tomberlin. And the number was wrong. Back then we did data entry by hand. There was no internet. Computers not everybody had a personal computer in 1990. And I had mistyped his number of at-bats, so his batting average was off quite a bit, actually, but it was off. Clearly it was off. And he had found that mistake. So it's interesting that really in my entire life and career, the only 4 words that Bill James has ever said to me was hello, and this is wrong.
Okay, a simple wrong would have done just fine.
And it's an interesting story to recall, but that was basically it.
And I guess final question for you, because you're a stats guy. And it's funny, I was because you mentioned about the minor leagues and such. I was at a Wilmington Blue Rocks game. And somebody was, and you know how they are with the screens and when the batter comes up and the stats and they give you a breakdown and stuff, what they can. And I am far from being any good with math. It's what kind of prevented me from finishing my history. Yeah, it was a fight to get my history degree. That's my background. But math, I suck, But yet, it's funny. I can do statistics, and when it comes to the game,
Well,
I don't know, asinine that way. But it's so anyway. There was a kid behind me, and she goes, could have been 14, 15 years old, and commented to her mom, "Oh, that don't seem any good." 289 or whatever the person was hitting. I can't remember. And I actually turned and I said, "Oh, you know how to, when you think about it, when they get to the major, if somebody makes it to the major league," she goes, "What's that?" I said, "With that particular number there, it's if you hit 3 out of 10 and have at least a 300 average, you're probably going into the hall."
Mm-hmm.
So I know in every other aspect in jobs and stuff, it's funny that if we screw up 7 out of 10 times, we're probably being fired.
You're fired.
Right. But anyway, the reason I'm bringing that up, and we're talking statistics of the game and the breakdowns of everything. What are you thinking with these different statistics that have come out since? Because obviously there's always been batting average, home runs, and there are certain key statistics that's been around the game forever. But now in recent years, they've added things like WAR and different stats. So for a guy like you that's followed it, the numbers so intensely, what's that like when they say, "Oh, well, we got this new stat on this," or "We got WAR," or "We got this"? What's your thoughts on something like that?
Sure. Well, in many ways, it's very, very good. It's always good to be more knowledgeable about the game and how it works and how the different pieces interact with each other. I mean, that's where I was, 40 years ago when all we looked at was batting average. And we were able to take batting average and say, okay, let's break that down to how often is the batter swinging at bad pitches, seeing balls versus strikes? How often does he make contact? After he makes contact, where does the ball go? The more granular you get, the more insight you get into what is actually going on. And I think what's going on now with exit velocities and launch angles and barrels and spin rates and things like that, I think it's good to have that knowledge. The danger I think we get into sometimes is trying to take that knowledge and project what's going to happen based off of that knowledge. And perhaps one day we'll be able to get to that point. But right now, these new statistics are great for describing what's going on. And I think that's really helpful for us. But taking that leap to be able to use them to project what's going to happen hasn't really gotten there yet. And I think that's a major leap that some analysts, some broadcasters are trying to make on their own now, and I don't think we're ready to do that yet. But as far as describing the game and helping us to understand it better, I think any new information that we could use is good information.
Yeah, I just thought about this as you were saying that, and I know there's these newer generations of coaches and stuff that are heavy into analytics. And I was actually at Wednesday, I was at a Brooklyn Cyclones game. And my buddy's season ticket spot, literally right next to the dugout and top step and all that. And they had, because when you were saying what you were saying there, I remember looking over because the coaches will be on the top step and stuff. And they had these charts and the graphs and, like different analytics and spin ratio, because I was able to see what's on the sheets. It's like, what happened to gut instinct with the game? It's good that we have the information, like you say, but it's like, what happened to letting the game play out and basing decisions what you see on the field?
There's a danger, but you're hoping that coaches and managers are able to take a look what's going on the field and just using the statistics as a tool. If your numbers say that the odds of something happening are, say, 80% on this particular situation, and it doesn't happen, and they decide that because it didn't happen, it's wrong. Well, when something is 80%, that means there's that 20% chance it's not going to happen the way you want it to. So with any type of statistics, you have to be careful how you use them. And some coaches are better than others in being able to figure out the best way to maximize their value. But everyone's different. Everybody has an understanding of the numbers differently. And I'm sure there are a lot of coaches out there that are quantitatively challenged. And so they might be using the numbers because they're being told they need to, and they may not be using them the best way they could. So it's something that has to be monitored, and hopefully it is being monitored.
So obviously, and like I said, the book is Fantasy Expert, but what's next for you coming down the pike for the rest of 2024? Sure.
Well, I still am involved in the baseball forecast, and we'll be coming out with the 39th annual edition this fall. So I'll still be working on that. In fact, I'm working on early versions of the introduction, working on that, looking at how we draft pitchers in the early rounds. And I was one of the guys who drafted Spencer Strider in the first round this year and got screwed. So is it smart to draft a pitcher in the first round or the first two rounds? And so I'm doing some research on that right now. There's probably some future books down the pike. I really enjoyed the process of writing Fantasy Expert, so I've got several more ideas for books that hopefully will be writing over the next few years. But always keeping busy. Writers got to write.
Exactly. Well, Ron, thank you so much for the time.
Okay. Thank you so much, Jonathan. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
The Whiz Kids had won it. Bobby Thompson had done it. And Yogi read the comics all the while. Rock and roll was being born, marijuana we would scorn. So down on the corner the national pastime went on trial. We're talking baseball, Klazuski, Campanella, talking baseball. The man and Bobby Fella, the Scooter, the Barber and the Nuke.
Hey there, Friday fans. We know how much you enjoy the movies. Enjoy grabbing your Friday merchandise and interacting with the Friday family, whether it be at conventions or during our particular watch-alongs. Well, when you're looking to get yourself masks, why not check out our friends over at Camp Blood Customs out of New York State and order your specific custom mask from any of the films. All orders are made specifically. Your needs and wants are. Make sure you find Camp Blood Customs on Facebook, Instagram, and all over social media and order yours today.
Hey, this is Brett Boone, former Major League All-Star, and you're listening to Crazy Train Radio.